three-party system is not 50% more complicated. It's not twice as more complicated. It's much more complicated than a two-party system. It's exponentially more complicated once you got a secondary market. The housing market became much, much more complicated. So what happened in the 1990s? We went from a two-party system or a three-party system to this, a 50-party system. The reason I'm showing you this is to say that this system now is so complicated that Ben Bernanke, when looking at his mortgage, he looked at instruments on his mortgage and he said, I have no idea what this means. It's incredibly complicated. Really, no one understands it. We securitized mortgages. We started subprime. We started taking money from China and putting it into communities. No one really understands this system. The reason that this is important is that this is a system gone amok. And it created redlining in a different way, reverse redlining. So here we have mature markets in the 1990s, and a couple of things happened. The world became a place where resources were being created. The amount of wealth in the world went from 35 trillion, that's with a T, to $70 trillion. And that money looked for some place to land. And the federal government directed that money to the housing industry. And where do you have an undeveloped market in the housing industry? In the areas that were redlined. But those people, investors, didn't know how to reach that market. And so we had securitized loans and subprime loans directing money to that market, directing money to Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, in the old red line areas. But now, not market rate loans, but subprime loans, using those complicated instruments that no one understands. And so when we look at foreclosures today, we see that foreclosures are in the red line areas that then became the reverse red line areas. That foreclosures are disproportionately, at least the first waves, were in the Black and Latino community. Now, some people say it had nothing to do with discrimination. It was that the banks should not have made those loans. They were forced to make the loans because of something called CRA, Community Investment Act. Not accurate. Only 6% of those loans came from depository banks. There were all these new fancy instruments that were being created by mortgage brokers that were directing money in subprimes in those communities. Kind of a complicated story. They made money by making the loans. They got fees, not by holding loans. The money was passing through very quickly. So there was investment, there was incentive to actually make as many loans as possible and to actually make them subprime loans. So who's to blame? In our individualistic society, where we think everything is about the person, we think this system is bad. We know that. But it must be because there's a bad person. And so we lock up Madoff, and we stop those ignorant or bad people in the Black and Latino community, and the problem is solved. Not. The problem is the system. The problem is that we have these complicated relationships. And throughout all of our efforts so far, there's been no effort to fix the system. Instead, we focus on fixing people. We have this atomistic view that there's a bad apple. When there's a bad apple, what do? You go get the bad apple. And we can do this in a way, in our society, we talk about colorblind. It has nothing to do with race. It has something to do with bad apples. But what if it's not the apple? What if the problem is the tree? Then it doesn't make sense to try to fix the apple. Instead, we might want to fix the soil. So what I'm suggesting, and this is particularly important during this period of time where people focus on people's attitudes instead of focusing on the work that our systems and structures are doing to promote or retard a just society or a sustainable world. We can stop looking for Archie Bunker. He's not the real culprit in this story. It is the system, the interrelationship between all these structures and what they're doing. And this is really leading into a longer talk that I won't give today On systems theory, the way we sort of grew up was learning about causation in a very linear model, in a very determined model. And it traces back to people like Newton and Galileo. No physicists today believe in that model. In fact, we now talk about systems. And there are two things about systems you should know. Causation is mutual and interactive, and there are feedback loops. So you have to study relationships, and you have to study the feedback loops. And out of that comes two things, one called vicious cycles, and one called virtuous cycles. We have to understand what the system is actually doing, not what people simply intend. System is about relationships, and it's about feedbacks. The failure to address this is not the failure of an individual, it's the failure, it has a powerful impact on whole populations and whole communities, and eventually the whole country. So we need to sort of have a different perspective on addressing these issues. There's some indication that a child who grows up in a high poverty neighborhood loses 4 IQ points, and the effect of that is to lose 1 year of school and virtually never catches up. Now, I don't know how many of you studied IQs, but IQs is supposed to be something that's set. It doesn't supposed to fluctuate. It's supposed to be innate. But it's suggesting that our culture, the kind of community we grow up in, has a profound impact on our physiology. And it also has a social cost in terms of what's lost to communities, $400 billion. So what should we do? What this suggests is that we need to think about opportunity, connecting people to opportunity. There's a debate that goes on in the African American community today, and it goes something like this. Why do we need to be integrated? Why do we need to be around white people? Why do we need to be around other people? Segregation is not such a bad thing if we had resources. Segregation has been and always has been about segregating people from opportunity. It's not just phenotypical. It's about structures. It's about getting some people access to powerful opportunities while denying that to other people. And in this country, we get confused because that structuring and sorting is racialized. So what's the solution? There are a couple of things I want to leave you with. One solution that you hear a lot of is something called universalism. And what I want to suggest is that's not the appropriate solution. Instead, there's something, and I've written a paper on this, called targeting universalism, that we need to be aware of everybody, but we need to also be aware that people are situated differently in relationship to structures and opportunity. So what this means is that if you have a program where the majority of people are poor, and you say we have an anti-poverty program, let's assume that the people in group B are people of color. So you say if we have an anti-poverty program, people of color will necessarily be the major beneficiaries because they're disproportionately poor. In fact, it doesn't work that way. And the reason it doesn't work that way is that because group B has multiple constraints. They're not just poor, they're also isolated. And unless you address both of those, if you just address the poverty, you remove that constraint, but you don't remove the isolation constraint. And so you have to look at multiple things at once to understand how people are constrained and why different racial groups have different experiences. And most social scientists look at one indicator at a time, which never reveals how people are actually being constrained. And instead of fixing the structure, we try to fix the person. We don't look at the structure that the person lives in, that the community lives in. And so that's what we need to do. We need to think about these powerful interrelationships and how these relationships affect us all, but some of us, both inside the country and outside the country, in a disturbingly racialized way. Thank you.